Welcome to the very first inaugural video podcast of Humanities and Western Civilization. You have reached Unit 1, Western Civilization and the Study of History. My name is Dr. Christian Knudsen, and I am going to be your guide through this General Arts and Science course. So you're probably wondering, what is a video podcast, and do I actually have to listen to these? The answer is no, you don't. The video podcast is really meant to replicate what you would do traditionally in a normal face-to-face classroom where the professor would give a lecture. So if you'd like to receive content that way, then absolutely you can watch these video podcasts, but the PowerPoints are there for you to download separate. So if you prefer to just go through the PowerPoints on your own, you could do that too. But we've got these great video podcasts, and there's one for every unit. Wow. That means that you've got 11 more to look forward to after this. You could binge watch them. You could, if you're tired of The Mandalorian or Game of Thrones, you could sit down and go through 10,000 years of human history. That is very exciting. I'm sure that you are excited to get started, so let's jump right in. So in every video podcast, there's learning objectives. Those learning objectives correspond to what we're doing in the unit as a whole. They're a good way for you to, check to make sure you're understanding the core concepts of that unit. So what are we learning in this video podcast? Number one, we are recognizing the difference between primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. What the heck are they, you say? Well, stay tuned and you'll find out. Really what this introductory lesson is about is how historians understand the past. How do we learn anything about the past? And if this is your first history course at the post-secondary level, well then, it's going to be different than maybe you've encountered history before. I think it's a lot more fun. We get our hands dirty. We really sort of, try to grapple with the past in sophisticated ways. And you can't do that if you don't know how to categorize and evaluate the sources that we would use to understand the past. So that brings us to point number 2. Understand how historians make conclusions about the past. How do they do that? Number 3, we're going to talk about something called original research. Original research is what historians do when they are investigating the past. And then how that term, original research, applies to primary and secondary sources. So that's something that you're going to learn. And then there's a word that you're going to find out about. It's a great word, historiography. It just rolls off the tongue, historiography. It's an important term for the course, so you're going to learn all about that. And finally, we're going to explain the dating conventions of history. I'm not talking about Tinder. I'm talking about, I'm talking about the dating systems that we use to categorize time periods in the past. Right, that didn't come out. Right, so let's just move right along. Why do we study history? Why on earth do we need to study history? There's a quote that Michael Crichton, an American author, you probably know him from such illustrious novels as Jurassic Park, said about history, and I think it's actually a really cool way of thinking about history. He said, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You're a leaf that doesn't know that it's part of a tree. That's, in a way, what we are. We're leaves, and we have roots that go deep into the past, and when we understand where we came from, then the whole world becomes richer, more colorful. We understand why things are so much better. Your life becomes richer. And also, this is an important point, you will do really, really well at Jeopardy, much better than your friends. So continue to take history. So the big question that I want you to ponder is, how do we know anything about the past? I mean, we see the past portrayed in all kinds of things, books, movies, television shows, but how do we know anything about it? How do we actually know what happened? If you watch a television documentary and it talks about, the pyramids in Egypt, how do we know what happened in Egypt all that time ago? If a historian says that such and such happened on this date, How do they know that? Where do they get that information from? So this is one of the things that you are going to be confronted with in this course, because prior to this, you have mostly just simply consumed history because people simply told you that this is the way it is. But what I want you to start to understand history as is as a conversation with the past, where what we know about the past may not be as clear as what you might think. So the sources for which we learn the past are divided into three categories. That's generally the way historians do it. The most important of those sources are primary sources. We're going to be talking about them first. The term secondary sources, sometimes we stop there with just the two types. Sometimes secondary sources are meant to apply to a broad range of sources. Your textbook, however, introduces a third sort of division called tertiary sources. And so we're going to follow that, because otherwise it'd be really confusing if I did something that was different from the textbook when you're reading the textbook. But it does actually offer a pretty good way of sort of adding a further category of sources. And really what this does is it allows us to think of sources in terms of quality. So what is a primary source? A primary source is anything at all that was created by humans in the past, but specifically in the time period that we are studying. So things from the past could be a letter that somebody wrote long ago. That is a primary source. Records from the past are primary sources. So imagine if you're doing genealogical research, that's like looking into your family tree, and you were looking at records of people immigrating into Canada, and you wanted to know when your grandparents, say, came here, and you're looking at old records. You're looking then at primary sources. Primary sources could be also something like a painting. It could be sculpture, something artistic. It could be old buildings, old ruins, anything that was created by humans in the time period that you are studying. Artifacts, objects, clothing, if it survives. Now, clothing doesn't survive very often for the far past, the deep past, because clothing is perishable for the most part. But if it does survive, then it's definitely a primary source. One of the types of primary sources that historians use all the time is literature, poems, and of course there's physical remains, archaeological remains of humans from the past. More recently, we actually have photographs and films. So if you are interested in, say, the First or Second World War, we actually have film footage. So that as well is a primary source. It was created in the time period in which you're interested in. So let's think for a second about William Shakespeare. You all know who William Shakespeare is, I'm sure. You were probably forced to read one of his plays or multiple plays of his in high school. William Shakespeare was perhaps the greatest playwright ever. And anyway, he lived in the 16th century in London, England. So let's think for a second that you wanted to know about his world, the world that he lived in, the world that is long, long gone. So what might be some of the primary sources for William Shakespeare? So obviously the writings, his plays are the most obvious examples. So that's something we still have today. We can look at it, and they were created by William Shakespeare in the time period. Perhaps there's also other primary sources, though, that might not be quite as obvious as his writings and his plays and his poems, right? And his sonnets, too. What about his tax records? What about tax records in general from that time period? If they existed, they'd tell us a lot about how people lived back then. It talk about, the expenses that they endured in their day-to-day lives. Surviving buildings would tell us a lot about their lives. We could look at the layout of those buildings, how big the bedrooms were, how the buildings were heated. That would tell you perhaps maybe what it felt like to actually be Shakespeare writing Romeo and Juliet in a room in the mid-16th century. We could look at paintings. Paintings could tell us what Shakespeare wore. There's a painting right here, in fact, and he's looking rather dapper. So, this is giving us an idea of what people looked like back then. And even a hat. If we had a hat of his, that also would be a primary source. Anything created by a human being in the time period is a primary source. They all are little bits left over from people that are long dead. So secondary and tertiary sources, we'll now move on to the other types of sources, are sources that are made by humans and concern the past, but are made after the time period that we are studying. So they weren't made in Shakespeare's time, if we're continuing with that example. So example would be something that I want you to learn a lot about in this course, which is peer-reviewed academic research by professional historians. This is sort of the highest quality of a secondary source. Also, your textbook is in fact it's a tertiary source, but we'll get into that later. But it's not a primary source. It didn't come from the time period that we're studying, so it's not a primary source. Magazines about history. If you're a history buff, you'll notice that there are actually people interested enough in history that they'll buy magazines about it, and that's just wonderful. That would be a tertiary source. And of course, there's teachers. There's me. That's me in the Davis Library. It made it look like a really cool library. The photographer did something really cool. It doesn't normally look like that, as you probably know if you've ever been to the Davis Library. So, TV shows such as The Vikings, movies like Titanic, even video games like Assassin's Creed, and even, of course, Wikipedia. If we're being honest, everybody uses Wikipedia at least once in a while, and it is a tertiary source. Random internet websites. Not particularly trustworthy, but another tertiary source. So what do all these things mean for history? Well, first of all, the only type of evidence we have is primary sources. Primary sources are our evidence. They are all we have left over from a people long gone. That's it. It is the only thing that historians would consider evidence. Tertiary and secondary sources altogether are in essence opinion. Sometimes good opinion, sometimes smart opinion, sometimes nonsense opinion, sometimes awful opinion, but opinion nonetheless. Secondary and tertiary sources are never. Okay, so I want you to do a bit of a thought experiment here. So here are some pictures from Tim Hortons Camp Day. If you've never heard of, well, first of all, Tim Hortons, I'm sure you know what Tim Hortons is. It's a coffee shop in Canada. Camp Day is one day a year where all the proceeds from the sale of coffee go to support these children's camps, where children who might not otherwise have enough money to go to a summer camp can go and have fun. And so it's a bit of corporate give back. And anyway, so here's some pictures from Camp Day, and let's imagine for a second that these were the only things that survived far into the future, say 1,000 years from now. There's been like some cataclysmic event, like Walking Dead level event that has just wiped out everything from our time period. And future historians now are trying to reconstruct what our world was like, and they don't know anything. They've got nothing to go by, and then suddenly they make a chance discovery and they find these Camp Day pictures. So what might they reasonably infer about our time period? What hypotheses might they come up with? What guesses might they come up with based on these photographs? So first of all, when you look at them, they would not necessarily know that what they're looking at is a bunch of kids having fun. They might interpret it very differently without any other context, without anyone from our time period to explain it. They would not necessarily be able to read the language. There's lots of languages of the past that we can't read today. A good example is the Olmec language, which was an ancient Mesoamerican civilization in Central America. We still don't entirely understand their written language. So we could imagine that these future historians, they don't know what this language is, so they really would be starting from scratch. So when you look at it, let your mind now sort of open up to possibilities of how future historians might interpret this. So yes, they could maybe look at it and say, hey, it's a bunch of kids having fun. But would they know that that's 100% correct? Of course not. They wouldn't be able to say that because they have no additional evidence to back it up. So they have to allow for other things. So maybe something else is going on here. Perhaps these kids are training for something. We could imagine this being almost like a military camp, a boot camp. Maybe these are child soldiers. These are top-level assassins. These are little miniature Jason Bournes. I mean, yeah, they look really scary. Look at that kid right there in the center with his hands clenched in fists on either side and a war face on. Man, you would not want to meet that kid in a dark alleyway. All over these pictures, we see kids training for war, training to kill. Is this ridiculous? Yes, it is. But it's possible that that's how future historians would see it. They also might look at it and say, it's all kids. Where are the adults? Well, maybe in this society, there are no adults. Maybe they are killed off at the age of 21. You know, there was a great 1970s sci-fi movie called Logan's Run where that was the premise, where you turn 21 and, you know, you had to die, and this guy named Logan decided that he was anyway, I'm getting off track, but he runs, and that's what the movie's about. So yeah, anything is possible. In the upper left-hand corner, everyone is got their hands in the air, but maybe what they're doing is a salute, an army salute, or maybe we're watching a religious ceremony. Who knows? All of these things are possible. The point is, when we look at sources from the past, primary sources from the past, we won't have the context necessarily. We won't know everything. And when you look at primary sources in this course, you won't have all the context, and you may be essentially facing the primary sources the same way future historians would be looking at these camp day pictures, starting from scratch. So one of the first things you have to learn as a historian is how to be critical and creative at the same time to come up with possibilities. So let's take a further look at tertiary and secondary sources. So obviously, they're not all created equal. Needless to say, you know, random website on the internet or Wikipedia is not as trustworthy as the work done by a professional historian when they're publishing in a peer-reviewed journal. So how do we determine what is trustworthy when it comes to secondary or tertiary sources? So at the very top are peer-reviewed sources, and we're going to talk about what that means. But suffice to say, this is where historians, when they are doing historian work, this is where they publish in what are called peer-reviewed sources. And there are journal articles, which are essentially like magazines for super nerds. They're not available at the grocery store. They're only in academic libraries. Or books also can be peer-reviewed. And these are the highest level of trustworthiness. One level down from that, we might imagine things like your textbook. So your textbook is not quite the same as a historian doing original research and publishing in a journal. The purpose of a textbook, if you think about it, is not to do new things with the past, but to educate students about what we already know about the past. So textbooks are not quite at the same level, and they don't go through a process of peer review. And again, I will explain what peer review is in a moment. Other examples of what you might think of as academic sources would be museums or public history exhibits, like plaques you might see, you know, like a plaque, a historical plaque that you might pass. It's got information about it. These are all, you know, reasonably trustworthy sources. So let's go down one further level. Popular history. Now, first of all, there's nothing wrong with popular history. I love popular history, but it is several tiers down on the trustworthy scale. Let me put it that way. So things like magazines about history that you could pick up at the grocery store, or a documentary that you watched on television about ancient Egypt or World War II, or let's say at least trustworthy websites, because we know some websites not naming any names or anything, are not particularly trustworthy. But let's say that there are some trustworthy websites. Let's imagine, for example, the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum's website. I am sure that they are reasonably trustworthy. So we call that popular history. This is history that is meant for a general public. Again, it's not doing what what historians are doing on those upper level things, the peer-reviewed sources. Now, it's those high-level sources that your textbook classifies as secondary sources. The lower sources are called tertiary sources. In the top level, that's where historians are doing what's called original research. That's where they are contributing new information to our collective knowledge on the past. And primarily, they're talking to each other. They're talking to other experts. It's equivalent to, say, doctors, talking to other doctors. So you wouldn't expect a cancer researcher to dumb down his or her research so that, I could understand it, because I don't know anything about, biology or anything. So if I was to talk to, a medical researcher, they'd have to dumb it down a lot for me. So, when they're doing that, then they're sort of essentially creating tertiary sources. But when they're creating original research, when they're engaging at that high level, they are creating secondary sources. So that's where they are talking with other experts in the field. So your textbook defines a secondary source as original research, peer-reviewed scholarship by historians. So an example of that would be scholarly articles published in peer-reviewed journals, scholarly chapters published in peer-reviewed volumes. So sometimes a group of historians will get together and they'll all publish different articles together into a book format, which they call a volume, and that can go through peer review. And also full books can go through the process of peer review as well. So what is peer review? So peer review is the process that's used by academic publishers and scholarly journals to ensure that the articles they publish meet the accepted standards of their discipline. What happens is when somebody, let's say me, I'm a historian, I'm out there doing some original research about the past, and I'm looking at primary sources, and I come up with some new discoveries. So I would write it up in a form of an article, and I would send it to one of these academic journals. And then they would subject it to peer review. And what happens is they would take my name off of it so that nobody would know that I wrote it. That would try to, keep my, historian enemies at bay, so that they're not going to sort of, deny my article publication because they don't like me. That's one of the reasons why they sometimes call peer review blind review, so that the people who are doing the reviewing don't know anything about the author. But essentially what the academic publisher would do is they would send out that article or that book to a panel of other experts. So other people like me, say, who would review it, and they are checking to make sure it meets the highest levels of research quality. And if it does so, then they say it has passed peer review, and it goes along and it gets published. So this is what your textbook defines as a secondary source, a source that has gone through this peer review process. Original research is always based on the analysis of primary sources. And as such, what it's doing is contributing some new knowledge, some new interpretation of the past to our collective knowledge about the past. Hey, there's that word, historiography. So I know you were waiting with bated breath for it to finally, for us to finally get to that in this video podcast. I'm going to finally explain what this word means. So historiography. So historiography is essentially the history of historical research on a subject. So when we're, say, talking about the historiography of ancient Egypt, I'm not actually talking about what happened in ancient Egypt. What I'm talking about is how historians' ideas about ancient Egypt have changed over time. Or rather, what's the story of historical research on Egypt? So I might say, 100 years ago they started opening up tombs and they started slowly translating texts, and now we know this. And then say in the 1950s they they tried this new approach to understand the past of ancient Egypt, etc., etc. That's what historiography means. When I'm talking about that stuff, I'm talking about historiography. Historiography is the broad scholarship on the subject. Another way of looking at it is the history of history. Needless to say, it may not be immediately obvious, but what we know about the past is constantly changing. We are constantly updating our collective knowledge on the past because of the ongoing work of historians. Now, sometimes this is because some new primary source that nobody knew existed suddenly comes to light, and it's dramatic, and it transforms our knowledge about the past. But more often than not, what historians are doing is they're looking at existing sources that people have already looked at, primary sources that we've looked at before, but perhaps asking new questions about those sources. A good example would be women's history. So if you went into the library now, you'd no doubt find lots and lots of books on women's history. But if you went back 100 years ago, nobody was writing about women's history. Even if you went back 50 years ago, hardly anybody had written about it. So you'd be like, wow, why is there no women's history? Do we not know anything about women's history? Well, the truth is that we didn't know anything back then. But it's not that we've suddenly discovered a whole trove of primary sources that we didn't know existed. No, instead, it's just that 50, 60 years ago, the historians that were alive then weren't actually that interested in women's history. And so they were looking at primary sources with different questions in mind. And there's plenty of evidence out there that would tell us about the lives of women in the past, but they didn't look at them or weren't interested in them. So as our questions about the past change over time, our knowledge about the past changes because we are constantly going back to primary sources again and again and asking new questions of it. Sometimes as well, we're reevaluating a conclusion that a historian made years ago, and maybe we think, hey, I don't agree with it. I think maybe we could look at it in a different way, and perhaps something else was going on in the past. So, there are many different ways that our knowledge about the past is constantly changing. So historiography is constantly changing. It's not static. Old ideas are constantly being replaced by new ideas. So, as a final reminder, historiography is not about the history, it is about the historians. So, let's sort of come back to tertiary sources now. So, we've discussed secondary sources, but tertiary sources. So, tertiary sources are sources that concern the past, that they're definitely not original research. So they're not trying to do something brand new. They're not confronting, evidence in the same way that a historian does. And certainly they're not subject to peer review. In general, tertiary sources have varying levels of trustworthiness. So at the high end, we have things like your textbook. At the low end, anybody could set up a random YouTube channel and say nonsense about the past, and that's obviously not very trustworthy at all. So tertiary sources encompasses a broad range of sources. So we think, for example, textbooks, magazines, teachers. I mean, I'm giving you a tertiary source right now. This podcast is a tertiary source. TV shows that you've watched, movies, video games, Wikipedia, random internet websites, all tertiary sources. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about just a sort of a proscript about dating systems in history. So the old system that you'll see most commonly in older textbooks, and actually our textbook uses it as well, is the system of AD and BC. So AD stands for Anno Domini, which is the Latin phrase for in the year of our Lord. It does not mean after death. I don't know. It just doesn't. It means Anno Domini. BC does mean before Christ. So this obviously is a Christian dating system. It was in fact designed by Christian monks about 500 years after the death of Jesus. And back then, there were different dating systems that were used, different calendars. And these monks were interested in how long has it been since Jesus was alive. And so they tried to figure it out. They started counting backwards. And eventually they landed on a number. And they said, we're living in the year 500 and something Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ. And that calendar system eventually stuck, and everybody uses it. Now, the thing is, though, is not all of us are Christian, yet we're stuck with this calendar, which is sort of based around a Christian concept. So we count forward from the birth of Jesus, and then if we're going before Jesus Christ, then we say BC. So more recently, there's been a movement to try to make this a little bit more neutral, given that we're not about to suddenly start, using a completely different, dating system. It's right now when I'm recording this, 2020 year of our Lord. So the new system is CE and BCE. CE stands for Common Era, and BCE Common Era, before Common Era. So this is it replaces the AD and BC system exactly. So CE replaces AD and BCE replaces BC, and it's just meant to be a more neutral system. So in the course, I have tried to maintain the new system of CE and BCE. But you will still encounter all over the place the old system. So you should be familiar with what it means. Okay, that's it. Look, you finished your first video podcast. So pat yourself on the back and welcome to the course. Right, C and BCE. There we go. Okay, that was a psych. Now we're done, I think.